So let's take a look at some alarming statistics between homeowners and renters and the average wealth gap between them. In 2022, the median wealth gap between homeowners and renters reached almost $390,000, and the average wealth gap over $1.3 million. Okay, over the past 33 years, the median wealth gap between homeowners and renters has increased by 70%, while the average wealth gap has increased more than 250%. During this period, homeowners' median and average wealth increased by almost $165,000 and $900,000 respectively. But for renters, the increases were only $5,800 and $56,000 respectively. So what does that tell us? That means that homeowners are growing their wealth faster than renters. But there is an underlying data point here that is not covered in this article. And the fact is that real estate simply maintains its value through periods of inflation better than any other asset. And that's not the homeowner's fault. I'm not saying this article vilifies homeowners or investors. What I'm saying is the real reason why this is happening is because the government is printing money essentially into oblivion and deflating the value of the currency, which means you need more currency to buy the same amount of products. And real estate, because it's so valuable to Canadians, is a hedge against that inflation. So by simply owning your own home, you are maintaining your purchasing power while the government is deflating the currency and inflating prices all the way around you. Take a look at the chart here. You can see it with your own eyes that homeowners' average wealth is growing at a tremendous rate versus renters. Like it's just, there's no argument left. Now, this article goes on to say a few things which I want to highlight here. Remember, these are not my words. This is directly from the article. We find that recent housing wealth gains are largely driving median wealth disparities. Because of supply shortages, home prices went up and rent prices also increased faster than incomes. This resulted in a higher housing cost burden among renters. Left with limited savings after paying for housing, renters have also not benefited from the strong financial market in the past several years, which further fueled the gap. I think there is a significant amount of information missing from this paragraph. Essentially, the writer is blaming supply shortages for the housing increasing the way it did. What they don't cover is the printing of the insane amount of currency Canada went through over the past 5 years. That inflation is the main driver of prices rising, not supply shortages. Of course, supply and demand comes into play, but it's secondary. It is secondary, even tertiary, to inflation. And it doesn't make sense to say that financial markets are strong, but renters didn't profit from it. I mean, everybody should profit from it, whether you're a renter or not, if financial markets are strong. So be careful what you read here. Where I do agree with the article is what they say here. Boosting the housing supply is critical to ensuring the housing and financial wealth gaps between owners and renters don't further widen. I would add to that to say that boosting housing supply is essentially giving an opportunity to everyone to own a home, which will eventually close that gap. Before we move on, we have to make one more comment about the article and the writer making reference that the recent housing wealth gains are largely driving median wealth disparities because of supply shortages. We need to elaborate that is complete nonsense. I just explained to you that inflation plays a much bigger role than housing shortages. Even if they're correct, explain to me how, if bread is more expensive and gas is more expensive and construction materials are more expensive and essentially everything is more expensive in our marketplace, is that all due to shortages? Do we have a shortage on gas, a shortage on bread, a shortage on wheat, a shortage on carrots, a shortage on everything in the marketplace? No, we don't. It's not all due to shortages. It's due to inflation. Inflation touches everything in the marketplace, and everything essentially has increased in terms of how much Canadian currency you need to buy it. And that comes directly from inflation. Shortages play a role, they do. but not more than inflation. Another important point here to elaborate on, housing wealth accounts for the highest portion of wealth disparities between homeowners and renters. What that means is that they're saying the wealth held in people's homes accounts for the largest portion between homeowners and renters. And this portion has increased substantially over the past 10 years. Fluctuations in home prices are highly correlated with the housing wealth gap. I think that's very obvious that in the last 10 years, housing prices have gone up dramatically, aka due to inflation, shortages, and high immigration. This article seems to want to blame homeowners or seem like they have an unfair advantage, when if you had the opportunity to buy a house, you saved, you grinded, you borrowed money, you did what you had to do, you qualified for a mortgage, you bought the house, you fixed the house, you cut the grass, you maintained it, you paid the mortgage. There's nothing wrong with that. That is the Canadian dream. That's what most people are after. And those people should not be vilified. It's not their fault. They just did what they had to do to get the job done. Take a look at this chart here. Housing wealth has fueled the gap between homeowners and renters. Now, what this tells me is that if you're on the outside looking in, you have two choices. You can complain, or you can do what's necessary to get the job done and become part of the people who own property in Canada. Owning property in Canada has been a good idea, not just for the past 10 years. I can show you the charts. You can look them up yourself, right on the government's website. Check CMHC. That housing has increased for the past 50 years. Not on a straight line, there's been bumps in the road, but if you bought something in 1950, an absolute guarantee in the GTA or anywhere almost that it is worth a hell of a lot more today than it was then. You would have done well. You would have maintained your purchasing power. So if you're on the outside looking in, this should tell you that, oh my God, I have to do what I have to do to get in the game. When I bought my first property, I lived in Toronto. I could not afford anything in Toronto. This is 2010. I still couldn't afford it, okay? I had to drive to Hamilton, Ontario, which at the time, in 2010, was considered the armpit of Ontario. They laughed then, but they're not laughing about Hamilton now. I paid $240,000 for a house, my first house in Hamilton, because that's what I could afford. But it seems like today, too many people are complaining. They're not willing to do the grind. I can't afford a house in my neighborhood. Well, you know what? Neither could I in 2010. I had to drive 75 minutes away from where I lived just to afford a cheap house. And it's time that you drive, do what you have to do, save anything that's possible to buy a house. Because if you really want that, no one's gonna hand it to you. You need to do the work to get it done. Here's where I agree, at least in some spaces. Let's give this a quick read. More housing supply is needed to mitigate the growing wealth gap. Without increasing both owner-occupied and rental housing supply, the growing wealth disparities between homeowners and renters are likely to persist. Here's a spot where I agree, at least in principle. More housing supply is needed to mitigate the growing wealth gap. I'm going to read this very quickly to you. Without increasing both owner-occupied and rental housing supply, the growing wealth disparities between homeowners and renters are likely to persist. We want to give more people an opportunity to own property. It can be done. The government needs to get out of the way, remove the red tape so that private equity and the private sector can build more houses. That's the only way, folks. Government's not going to solve the problem for you. They need to get out of the way. A recent Redfin survey finds that more than a third of young home buyers plan to use a cash gift from family to fund down payments, suggesting that intergenerational wealth may fuel gaps among the next cohort of home buyers. In other words, if the housing supply fails to keep up with demand, households with financial resources will continue to build wealth with almost no effort. The no effort part I don't agree with. That's insane. Meanwhile, households with limited ability to build wealth, who are most likely to be households with lower incomes, and households of color, will remain renters and face higher housing costs that further restrain their ability to save for future home ownership. I agree with the first part about more housing supply is needed. The rest is just garbage. If you apply incentives to people to give them a chance to buy their own homes, they will. That means giving people help with their down payment, allowing the private sector to build more affordable homes, townhomes, stacked townhomes, condos. Have the government give access to land at a cheap price so that we can build. Stop printing money and inflating the cost of everything. How about this? How about lowering the tax when it comes to buying new property? Because most people don't understand that the biggest chunk of cost in any new property, new condo, townhouse, single family home, goes to the government in taxes, HST, development fees, regional development fees, and all kinds of fees which you would not believe. The profit margin for new developers is somewhere in the 7 to 13%. Taxes make up more money than the actual profit. You need to understand that, folks. So if you're a young Canadian and you want to get into a property, don't yell at us. Yell at the government to remove the red tape and allow people like me to build more houses for people like you. That's how it used to work, and we were okay. In summary, this article is way off base. They are not assigning blame where they need to assign blame. They seem to be insinuating that homeowners have some kind of decided advantage, which I don't think is true. I think those people, me being one of them, worked really hard to get to where they were. I was handed nothing. My friends were handed nothing. They worked their jobs, they saved their money, and they bought a property. And the only thing that's in everyone's way at this point is government regulation, government inflation, and red tape. If we can remove those things, everyone will have an easier time to buy a property. That is the solution that should be in this article, and that's what you should be pushing for too, if you are a young Canadian wanting to buy a property. If you don't agree, post your comment below. I want to know what you think. I want to be as humble of a YouTuber as possible. So if you can show me data that contradicts what I'm saying, I want to see it, and I'll use it in my next video. I'm speaking to the young folks here. Are you ready to take control of your financial future? Or do you want to make a bunch of excuses and complain and hate with your friends over the dinner table? Hit that subscribe button, join our community. I will give you insights. I will tell you how to escape from where you are now to get to where you want to be. I'm happy to help you. I've helped many people just like you. I want you to be one of them. If you found this video helpful, give us a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below.